Just a few miles out from the centre of Derby lies a stately home that has remained largely unchanged for centuries. As you walk around the magnificent grounds and gaze in awe at the 18th century furnishing in each room, all painstakingly designed and crafted with meticulous care and attention, you could be forgiven for thinking that the family butler could come around the corner with afternoon tea at any moment. Or when you look out the window, you're going to see a horse and carriage riding up to the mansion, carrying British aristocrats ready for an evening dinner party. But there appears to be something more than just the palpable sense of history lingering around Kedleston Hall. Something more paranormal. Something that you most definitely won't be able to read about in the guidebook. I hope you are ready for a history lesson with this place, because we are getting into it. And one thing which makes Kedleston Hall quite remarkable, really, is that the land has been owned and occupied by the same family for almost 900 years, because the Curzons, as they are now known, still live there to this day. They initially were not known as the Curzons though, they were the de Corsons, which is quite a French sounding name, you may think. Well, Norman. Yep, they are another family who sailed across the Channel with William the Conqueror, the chap who took over running the show after the Battle of Hastings in 1066. And it was only up from there for the de Corsons. During the reign of King Henry I, so early 1100s, a Richard de Courson was recorded as holding the estate of Kedleston from the even more powerful de Ferrers family. And so that meant that it was kind of like renting it, but not in the modern landlord-tenant sense. The de Corsons could keep any income that the estate made, they controlled it, they could pass it down the generations. But the obligation was that Richard de Courson had to provide the military service of 4 knights to the de Ferrers. In other words, the land was considered valuable enough to fund 4 fully equipped medieval soldiers whenever the de Ferrers family went to war. In exchange, the de Corsons could treat the estate like their own. Not too much long after that, about 1150, they are recorded as owning the estate, but from then on, generations of de Corsons, and after they anglicised their name Curzons, were born, lived and died on this estate. Some more traumatically than others. In 1727, Sir John Curzon, 3rd Baronet, he fell from his horse while hunting out on the estate and died in the house 3 weeks later in his early 50s. But that house where Sir John died isn't the one that you tour around today. That earlier one was built around 1700 for John's dad, Sir Nathaniel, and it was the earliest record we have of what Kedleston actually looked like. Because yeah, while the estate dates back centuries before that, we have no real description of the earlier houses that stood here. But even this red brick Queen Anne style house didn't really last that long. It was only lived in for 59 years before the next and final Kedleston Hall was built. And we have Sir Nathaniel Curzon to thank for that, the man who would later become the 5th Baronet. By that point, the Curzons, they'd made a bit of a name for themselves as politicians. They were reasonably well-to-do, not exactly bottom of the pecking order kind of thing. Nathaniel, he had even loftier ambitions though. He went and married a woman called Caroline Collier, the 2nd Earl of Portmore's daughter, in 1750. So already marrying up. And even before inheriting the estate, he'd started to think about how Kedleston should reflect that new status, and he began dabbling with plans to improve the house. Then in 1758, his dad, also called Nathaniel, he died, and so Junior, he inherited the baronetcy and Kedleston Hall. Now that he was man of the house, married to an earl's daughter, and wanting to keep up appearances, also definitely to rival Chatsworth House about an hour up the road, Sir Nathaniel completely flattened the old hall to start from scratch again. He actually made an agreement with 2 well-established architects, Matthew Brettingham and James Payne, who initially kicked things off with the construction. But then Sir Nathaniel got chatting to a younger architect called Robert Adam and saw some of the drawings that Robert had done while out in Rome. At that time, Robert was already designing and building and landscaping the pleasure grounds out on the estate, so he'd already been around as work on the new house started. And so Nathaniel kind of decided, yeah, I like what you're doing better. Can you take over things and build my new house for me? Construction had started in 1759, but by April 1760, Robert Adam was fully running the show, with the house complete by 1765. It cost £36,000 to build, which sounds so cheap, but with inflation calculated, it was just shy of £7 million in today's money. So even back then, it doesn't matter, I would have been way too poor to even contemplate. The thing was, yes, Sir Nathaniel, who by that point had also been given the title of First Lord Scarsdale too, he wanted this magnificent house as the Curzon family seat, and so he'd had this brand new house built, but it wasn't to live in full time. He was down in London mostly. Kedleston was built to be this pleasure palace, somewhere to bring your posh mates so that they can all be impressed by how much money and status you have. Just casually dropping 7 million so your mates can go, oh my god, when they pull up at your weekend pad. But even so, Kedleston was impeccably maintained. When the family descended on the house, they would entertain the highest society, hunt on the estate, throw lavish dinner parties, the works. Time continued on, more generations of Curzons lived and died, Kedleston passing down the family tree each time, until we get to possibly the most influential Curzon, George Nathaniel. He was born at Kedleston in 1859, and while he didn't inherit the hall until 9 years before his death, his life? Very interesting. And if I went into all of it, this episode would probably be about 3 hours long. So I'll give you a somewhat trimmed down version, but it is me, so it's not that trimmed down really. But when he was a kid, he was treated horribly by his governess. The woman who was supposed to be looking after him. She banned toys from the nursery and forced him to exist on a diet of only tapioca pudding or rice pudding and nothing else. She also was apparently violent towards him as well, which would have been awful for him to grow up with. When he was 17 years old too, he fell from his horse and crushed a vertebra, so lived most of his life in pain from his bad back. And it was thought that that all contributed to his rather infamously dour, severe, humourless demeanour, although his classmates at Eton weren't anything resembling sympathetic towards him. One of them wrote the poem, "My name is George Nathaniel Curzon. I am a most superior person. My cheek is pink, my hair is sleek. I dine at Blenheim once a week." That was written by boys who attended Eton College, widely considered one of, if not the most, prestigious and elite school that a well-to-do family can send their sons to. But as he got older, a bit like his great-great-granddad Sir Nathaniel, George Nathaniel also had incredibly lofty ambitions, which, I mean, you could say he achieved. In 1895, he married a wealthy American heiress called Mary Leiter. The money was obviously a great thing for the Curzon family, but the pair really were in love. In 1899, though, George Nathaniel would take the family name to new heights when he became Viceroy of India. Effectively, he became the man in charge of ruling the subcontinent on behalf of the British Crown. As in, the only person above him in status was Queen Victoria herself. Very important man. Mary, she obviously went out to India with her husband as she was now vicereine, and she became talk of the British Empire when at the 1903 Delhi Durbar, a celebration held for the ascension of King Edward VII, Mary wore an iconic gold and silver embroidered dress, made to look like hundreds of peacock feathers. Mary, though, she was so much more than just this dress she wore, the family she came from, and the man she married. During her time as vicereine, she helped to open up a nursing hospital and started a fund to support women's health in India. And she was also actually somewhat responsible for saving a species of animal from being hunted to near extinction. Her husband absolutely loved a spot of hunting, as you can now see from the trophy corridor of Kedleston Hall. Absolutely full of his trophies. They were out hunting in Kaziranga, an area that had been famous for the number of Indian rhinos. George Nathaniel quite fancied adding one of those to the wall back at home. As they were out looking, they could not find a single one, only the footprints in the mud. And it was at that point that Mary pointed out to George Nathaniel that they really needed to do something about it, and so the Kaziranga Proposed Reserve Forest was established in 1905. And it's still there to this day, protecting animals, being home to Bengal tigers, elephants, and over 2,000 of these Indian rhinos now, which is 2/3 of the world's entire population. And so that's a fantastic thing to come out of a hunt, despite the fact that Curzon himself was an enthusiastic participant in hunting. George Nathaniel remained viceroy until he lost the support of the British government over a dispute with the Commander-in-Chief of the British Indian Army, Horatio Herbert Kitchener. And so in 1905 he resigned and returned home. His career was really past its peak by that point, but things would get so much worse in his personal life the year after, in 1906. Mary and George Nathaniel had 3 daughters together, but it's probable that they were trying for a son, a male heir that could inherit everything. Unfortunately, Mary suffered complications after a miscarriage, and her health never really recovered. She died on the 18th of July 1906 at their home in London, aged just 36 years old. George Nathaniel had a memorial chapel built in the church on the Kedleston estate, with a marble effigy of Mary laying next to her husband being tended to by angels. Mary, she was buried underneath in the family crypt. And George Nathaniel, he was completely heartbroken by the death of his wife. He wrote that "There has gone from me the truest, most devoted, most unselfish, most beautiful and brilliant wife that a man ever had, and I am left with 3 little motherless children and a broken life. Even though to everyone else he was this severe, possibly even aloof man, but he really had loved his wife so much. But just on their 3 daughters, just as an aside, all my life, the drama. I'd need a whole other video to get into the scandals because, yeah, fascists, royal connections, affairs, husbands' affairs with stepmothers-in-law, so much tea. But back to George Nathaniel though, he did remarry in 1911 to another wealthy American called Grace Duggan. Worth noting that weddings like this would usually have taken place in the family chapel, so they would have got married in the same church where Mary, his first wife, was interred, beneath an effigy of himself lying next to her. Yeah. George Nathaniel and Grace didn't have any children together, so when he died in 1925, Kedleston and all of the family titles passed to his nephew, Richard Curzon. During the Second World War, Richard joined the army and also offered Kedleston to the British Army, an offer they eventually did take him up on, and so it became a Y station, listening out for and intercepting German codes that were sent on to Bletchley Park so that they could crack the Enigma code. Richard did make the stipulation that the army were not allowed inside the house. You stay out there. So Kedleston did survive relatively unscathed from the war. Apart from one building, the blacksmith's forge, was damaged by a bomb. Further on into the 20th century though, and inheriting and maintaining an estate like this was getting more and more difficult. Because Richard also didn't have a male heir to pass Kedleston onto, on his death in 1977, everything fell to his first cousin, Francis Curzon. Francis, who had been the estate manager since 1970, knew that there was absolutely no way he was going to be able to pay the death duties of £2.5 million. The income that the estate generated, not to mention the house being quite run down by that point, he just wasn't even going to be able to come close to covering it. And so it was at that point where he struck a seemingly perfect deal with the government and the National Trust. Francis and his family would be allowed to live in a self-contained wing of the house, rent-free. He also wouldn't have to pay any inheritance tax, and in exchange, the National Trust would take over control of Kedleston Hall. The money generated from visitors would fund the £400,000 yearly maintenance of the estate. And so, I mean, in the face of impossible inheritance tax, doesn't seem like a bad shout, really. You still get to live in your ancestral home, just not all of it, but not to mention, no rent. No mortgage. I could really do with a long-lost first cousin getting in touch round about now and telling me I'm about to inherit something like that. When Francis passed away in 2000, the title of Viscount Scarsdale passed to his eldest son, Peter, but it was another one of his sons, Richard, who moved into Kedleston with his family. And that is who still lives there to this day. In one form or another, centuries of history tied to one family, which is just wild to think about. But I know that that was quite a lot of history thrown at you. This is feeling like a properly vintage Don't Scare Claire episode. But the reason is because Mr. DSC and I did a massive in-depth tour of the house and we just found it absolutely fascinating. Obviously we were drawn there for the ghost stories though, of which there are plenty. Not that they're readily advertised, but don't worry, I will share them with you. And you could walk past the first ghost of Kedleston before you're even out of sight of your car, because a strange amorphous thing has been seen a few times over the last few years on the outdoor security camera fixed to the visitor reception building. It's described as ectoplasmic. It's not a figure or anything. And so your immediate thought is, oh, it's like a smudge on the lens or something. But if it was a cobweb or something like that, it wouldn't just be there and disappear. It would stay for a bit, would get blown away, anything like that. But I'm just starting you off in the shallow end. I'm giving you a little taste. And there's so much more to Kedleston Hall too, that you get an extra history with the ghost part as well. I'm not even sorry. But out on the grounds, the Robert Adam Bridge, named so as Robert Adam designed it, that has a very interesting ghost story. And so this bridge, it crosses one of a series of little lakes that were created by damming the brook that cuts across the grounds. And it's very intentional in its placement and design. It's obviously not half bad to look at, but also it gave the Curzon family's guests the opportunity to sweep across the front of the house and give them that impressive view of Kedleston before they would be greeted for whatever entertainment lay in store for them. It was almost as if they were manufacturing that, oh my god, it's so impressive kind of moment, so they could shower the Curzons with adoration about their beautiful house. It's clever. But anyway, the ghost story here happened in September 1944. A woman and her 10-year-old son, Peter Slater, was staying with a friend that the mother had made through the WI, the Women's Institute. The friend's name was Violet Huddleston, and she was the daughter of the estate's gamekeeper, living on site in North Lodge. Mum and Peter were staying with Violet and her father for the weekend, and as kids do, Peter decided the first evening he wanted to go and have a wander around the estate, have a bit of a play. Violet told him, "You are absolutely more than welcome to, just make sure that you stay on the north side of the Robert Adam Bridge. Don't go any further than that." That was because it was 1944, the army were there operating the Y station by that point. Probably not a good idea to get in the army's way during a war, you know? It was a quiet evening and a mist had rolled in. Just a typical setting for a ghost story, really. Peter had wandered all the way down to the Robert Adam Bridge when he noticed on the other side of the bank there was a bottle trapped in some weeds. His little 10-year-old brain said, "Ooh, could be a message in a bottle." And so it absolutely had to be checked out, at least to rule out the possibility that Captain Hook was leaving him secret messages, you know? Peter crossed over the bridge onto the forbidden side, but thankfully had the good sense to not get any closer to the house from where he was stood. As he picked up the bottle, he noticed a woman cantering towards him on a chestnut-coloured horse. This lady was slim, wearing a grey dress and a black veiled hat. She looked very poised and elegant, riding side saddle on her horse. As she approached Peter, she slowed down and smiled at him before continuing to canter away. Okay, fair enough. Out for an evening ride, maybe? Also, in Peter's eyes, he didn't get told off for being the wrong side of the bridge, so happy days. He went back up onto the bridge, thinking to himself that he was just going to watch this woman on her horse, but when he looked around, she was absolutely nowhere to be seen. He looked about him in all directions, but that woman and her horse were completely gone, which wouldn't have been possible in the mere seconds that had elapsed since they were face to face, or face to horse's shoulder, being big beasts. Okay, well, now that was a little bit more unnerving. Peter started trudging his way back towards North Lodge, a little bit confused about what he'd seen. When he got to North Lodge, he told Violet about the strange disappearing woman. All she said was, "Oh, you've seen the lady in grey." Yeah, loads of estate workers have seen her over the last 100 years or so. So I guess that's kind of reassuring to hear, maybe? But while she has apparently been seen numerous times, we don't really have a clear idea of who she was specifically. Whether she was one of the Curzon family, out for a ride on her favourite horse, or whether it's a woman who predates the hall that stands there now. Because back before the current 18th century house was built, there was a road that actually ran through the grounds, around where that woman was seen riding. When the new house was being designed, this Kedleston Road was moved back to where it is now. You know, out the way, so it doesn't spoil the family's lovely view from the house. So could this be a woman riding along the old road? Possibly. We just don't know. But while we're at the Robert Adam Bridge, you might turn to face the house and think to yourself, yep, that is a nice looking place. But something that you might also think to yourself is that, isn't it odd? The church is super close to Kedleston Hall. You can just see it peeking out behind. It doesn't feel like it's got that intentional, meticulous positioning that you see with most other things on the estate. And it's a large church, isn't it? For what would have been the family's chapel. Yeah, not unusual for wealthy families to have their own chapel built for Sunday service. Christenings, weddings, funerals, whether you're hatched, matched or dispatched. But this church, it wouldn't look out of place in a small village. Well, yeah, the reason for that is because it was the church for a small village. Because it wasn't just the road that Nathaniel had moved for his new pad. There was a little village around that road. More hamlet really, just a few cottages and an inn, and most of it inhabited by people who worked for the Curzons anyway. But to make room for his brand new house, it was all swept away, saving only the church. And so that's how the Curzon family came to be living very close to their dead relatives, who'd been getting buried there for centuries before that. They do have a bit of a sense of humour about it though. There's a sundial on the side of the church that you can see out of the window of the state apartment bedroom that says "We shall" above it. We shall, and sundial. We shall soon die. Bit of a memento mori. But the church itself, it has been changed about quite a bit. One side of it dates back to the 13th century, proper medieval, whereas walk around to the other side and it's 20th century, due to, of course, George Nathaniel's memorial chapel he built when his wife Mary died. And as planned, he was interred with her underneath the altar tomb down in the family crypt. And actually under that marble effigy of them laid side by side, there's a racking with space for 3 coffins. Mary's coffin is there, so is George Nathaniel's, but the third space is empty. That spot was for Grace, his second wife. She didn't fancy spending her afterlife interred below them both, so she opted to be buried out in the churchyard away from them. Can't really say I blame her, to be honest. The earliest interment at the church, though, is Richard de Curzon, before they anglicised the name, who died in 1275, and he's buried alongside his wife. And they're both buried upright, as they were already thinking about saving space even back then, because the Curzon family are still using this crypt, still being interred alongside their ancestors, as recently as 2014. But the reason I'm going on about the church so much, aside from I just want to tell you all of the gossip that I found utterly enthralling, is because strange things have been reported in here. In September 2024, a family went running up to a staff member in the restaurant, exclaiming that they'd just come from the church and they'd photographed a ghost. They were adamant they saw nothing at the time, but on a photo taken, there was what looked to be a figure standing towards the nave of the church. But this next story is even more recent than that, because in March 2025, an electrician had come out to check over the electrical distribution board for the church. The only instructions he had been given was that this board was down in the church's basement. As the National Trust don't actually own the church, it's looked after by the church's Conservation Trust, the National Trust staff hadn't a clue in which direction to point this guy in. Thinking that this basement just must mean the crypt, a staff member took the electrician down the narrow spiral staircase, where he wasted no time leaning over coffins, inspecting the walls, looking for this board. The impression you get is that this man wasn't creeped out by the dead. He had a job to do and he was going to do it. Anyway, the board wasn't down there, and it eventually came out that it was actually in another basement, which you access via the outside of the church. Again, off he goes down into this basement, alone this time. All of a sudden, a blood-curdling scream ripped out from that church basement. Oh my god, are you okay? What happened? Yeah, the electrician had put his hand down on a live rat. I love rats. I used to have them as pets, but I think I would scream too if I'd put my hand down somewhere and was not expecting to get a handful of rat. But the guy, once he'd calmed down, he did what he needed to do, and that was that. But it's what happened next that had some people wondering whether his rather loud outburst disturbed something. I mean, that outside basement shared a wall with the family crypt, because later that same day, a staff member was there alone, coming around to lock up. It was completely dark by that point, late enough in the evening that everyone had gone home. There shouldn't have been a soul about. As he entered the church though, he heard the muffled sounds of two ladies deep in conversation. They had very posh accents, but he couldn't make out what either of them were saying. He slowly started to walk towards the sound, which he pinpointed to a pew a couple of rows back from the front. A pew that, even in the dark, he could see was empty. He took a few more steps towards them, and they were still having this hushed conversation, until he reached the pew just behind the voices. As soon as he got there, the voices stopped. Abruptly, like someone had switched them off. Well then, that was incredibly weird, but he continued to lock up, and that was that for the night. A few weeks later though, another member of staff was standing outside what is now a second-hand bookshop, not too far from the church, when just like the first employee, she heard the low mutterings of two high-class ladies. As she turned around towards the voices, there was no one there. But then again, a few months after that, another staff member who was in early in the morning this time, around 7 AM, before anyone else, he was walking outside in a passageway between the church and the stables, when he too heard the women chatting away. Turned round, just as before, no one there. That last encounter happened in the autumn of 2025, so whether any other staff members will hear these mysterious phantom ladies, it remains to be seen. But for us, the stables are the next spot that I need to tell you about. The stable block at Kedleston Hall is bigger than any house I could ever hope to own in my lifetime. The 8-year-old me, who was that weird horse girl in school, about died looking at this bit. But back in the estate's heyday, this area would have been a hive of activity, whether the Curzons were in residence or not. Because Kedleston, like so many other estates, would have been its own self-contained unit. It would have had an on-site bakery, a brew house, apple store, all of these different things. And at Kedleston, in this building in particular, they even had a pleasure dairy. The actual main dairy would have been elsewhere, but her ladyship would have enjoyed having a go at making her own butter and cheeses. So there was a little dairy for her to do that. But the top floor of the stable block, that would have been accommodation for all the grooms. It was this separate community in its own right, with this area sort of being the beating heart of the estate. 40 to 60 people would have been employed at any one time to keep the estate going, so it would have felt like this bustling hubbub of people coming and going, busy with their work. But now, inside the main stable, where the Curzon family's prize stallions and guest horses would have been stabled, the presence of a stable boy has been picked up. Others in this area say that they can clearly feel the energy of all the people who would have been busy looking after the horses in here. And that's really not a reach. I can totally see what they mean. We visited on a sunny day. The natural light was streaming in through the windows, the high partitions with space for 48 horses just lined up all along the walls. This would have been where your best horses were kept. They would have wanted for nothing. People would have been running around tending to their every need. It does feel like all the horses were just on turnout and they could have been brought back in at any moment, and the room would have been just as busy as it was a century ago. One really interesting encounter happened in the stables in 2019 though. 3 American visitors were being shown around, but as soon as they got to the stable yard, one of the women suddenly stopped in her tracks. She was overcome with this intense emotion. She started crying, and the staff member who was with them was a bit concerned, like, "Are you okay? Do you need a minute?" To which she replied, saying that she had been here before. She knew this place, knew this building, because she had worked here. Okay. Yeah, apparently she was absolutely convinced that in a past life she had worked at Kedleston as a groom, and so it was as if fate had brought her back in another life, and all of these memories just came flooding back to her, which I can't even imagine a feeling that strong, knowing a place that you've never been to before. That must have been pretty wild to experience. But now it is time for the main event. Let's get chatting more about the history and ghosts of Kedleston Hall itself. So the way that you can get into the hall nowadays is through a little side door, which brings you into the west wing staircase. You can go left to the cafe, which does a fantastic jacket spud, I can confidently say, or go right into the trophy corridor. But these stairs are where staff have reported weird goings on. The sounds of heavy breathing and disembodied footsteps have been heard. But something that will really make you jump is the booming sound of doors slamming. One staff member was alone one evening, about 8 o'clock at night. No one else was around and the building was all locked up for the night. All of a sudden, he heard it. One of the doors off this west wing staircase, bang, slammed. He knew for a fact he was alone, so he went to check, thoroughly searched the area, but there was nothing out of place. He sort of tried to dismiss it a little. Oh, it's a windy night out tonight, could have been a draft. But considering the value of the furniture and the paintings and artefacts at Kedleston, and how fragile a lot of them are, and then how closely humidity and temperature are controlled in a property like this, there's no way, surely, a stray draft would be strong enough to slam a door like that. I don't know. There is a ghost story that's been passed down through the staff that claims that there's the ghost of a servant girl here who was pushed down the stairs by her father because he was angry with her for some reason. She unfortunately died of her injuries. As far as I could tell, there's no record of that happening, and some versions of the story even say it's more of a this servant girl is a sad spirit and she can't be arrested kind of thing. But either way, it's thought that she may be responsible for the heavy breathing, the footsteps and door slamming in this area. But visitors may also come into contact with her. On multiple occasions, people claim that they feel the energy of a girl, along with this palpable sadness, and they just can't explain why. Whatever her story may be, it doesn't seem to be a happy one. But if you walk through the trophy corridor, you'll come to a narrower corridor, and if you look up in here, you'll see the old servant bells still up on the wall. The reason they're there is that they're opposite the butler's pantry, and so he would always be in earshot of the bells in case the family needed something. I think you can already tell where I'm going with this one, because those bells have been heard ringing, even though the mechanism is completely disconnected. Proper Christmas Carol stuff. But there are stories of more echoes of household staff still lingering at Kedleston Hall. The grand staircase is said to be haunted by a woman seen wearing a mob cap and an apron, but she does seem to take the time to get to know you too. There was a member of staff called Craig who was opening up early one morning. He was the only person in the house, no one else had got there yet. As he was standing near the bottom of the stairs, he heard clearly a woman's voice shout his name, Craig! Again. No other staff member was at work yet. He should have been completely alone, and yet someone had just shouted for him. Some think that because of the woman seen on the stairs, this voice may have belonged to the ghost of Mary Garnett, the first housekeeper hired at this version of Kedleston Hall. In life, Mary was this charismatic, full of personality woman who was extremely well liked by the family and well trusted too. She was so near and dear to the Curzons and Kedleston Hall that she actually had a portrait done of her. Okay, it's not the best quality portrait, they didn't spring for a super expensive artist, but still, to have your own portrait, That is unheard of for a housekeeper. And in that portrait, you'll see that she's holding a little book. This is actually the first ever guidebook for Kedleston Hall, which Mary herself wrote. And she took immense pride in showing people around the house. She was sort of the first proper tour guide that the hall had. But she was so intelligent and articulate. She could get along with tradespeople who were there to do a job just as well as she could with dukes and their families who were guests at the house. We don't know much more about Mary's life other than she became a housekeeper in her 40s and remained in service for 43 years. She was paid half the salary of the butler, even though she was effectively housekeeper and tour guide, but that was apparently because the butler had to travel around with the family. When she passed away in 1809, the family broke one more social convention just to show their admiration for her. Mary was buried right next to the door of the church. Again, unheard of. So make sure you wipe your feet on the way in. I feel like Mary's the sort of person who would call you out if you muddied up the floors. Not that there's any indication that she's anything but a benevolent entity still roaming the hall. But the same can't be said for a different area of Kedleston, a place that, perhaps for the best, isn't open to the public. Because off the very impressive Welcome Hall, which you might recognise from the banquet scene of The Duchess starring Keira Knightley, there is a staircase that leads up to some very modest rooms. One of these is called the cross-stitch flat, which back in the day would have been used by the housekeepers. Whether Mary herself used it, I don't know. But cross-stitch flat has a heck of a reputation with staff members nowadays. It's the one area out of the entire hall where some staff refuse to go up into alone. It's incredibly creepy and makes a lot of people feel overwhelmingly uneasy as soon as they set foot in it. One of the facilities assistants refused point blank to go in there at all because of the vibe, claiming something totally dreadful lurked there. The thing is, it's not the only flat up there, so for only that room in particular to stir up these negative feelings in employees, it's quite strange. But heading back down into the main rooms of the house, and the drawing room is the next one that deserves a mention. I think, aside from the stables, this might be my favourite room in the house. It's so extra, I love it. I love the damask in here, which was the exact same damask that decorated the walls when the house was built. And they actually recreated the exact wool and silk blend from a sample back in 2001, after the original rotted away in 1870. They also used that same damask on the sofas, which are rather opulent, I think you'll agree. They're just way too good to sit on. You certainly can't be sitting there rotting with a bag of Doritos watching Netflix on them, can you? But also, as good old Alan Titchmarsh said in his Secrets of the National Trust show, he walked into the drawing room and just said, "If it doesn't move, gild it." Which, yeah, I can see that. These sofas were made in 1765 by John Linnell, featuring languid mermaids and sea gods. And if they feel a bit extra for a sofa, you're not wrong. These designs were taken from Linnell's drawings that he'd come up with for George III's coronation carriage. He didn't win the job, but not wanting the designs to go to waste, they were made for the Kedleston sofas. They were crafted down in London and transported up on the back of a cart, which doesn't seem like the most secure move. And when they reached the hall, they were completely smashed up. And so it took months for them to be put back together by a local man who was paid for gluing bits on sofas. But in this room, one of the cleaners has picked up on the presence of an 18th century maid. And she gets the distinct impression that this maid, not bothered about her being on the phone, whatever, magical brick that you talk to in your pocket, but the vacuum. Fascinating. She cannot get enough of it. I just think that's so sweet though. I bet she's thinking the time that she could have saved having one of those. But moving on, the dining room was another opportunity for the Curzon family to show off just how rich and powerful they were. At one end of the dining room, you'll see a wine cooler made of solid jasper. Back in the day, it would have been filled with crushed ice to keep your wine cool, as the name suggests, Claire. Obviously, in the 18th century, there was no refrigeration, so it was a very high-class thing to have a chilled wine in the summer. So of course, your wine cooler would be out in the dining room for guests to see. But look at all this ice we have that we store in our very own ice house. The wine cooler that's on display right now though, while it has been at Kedleston since 1758, it's not the only one that the Curzons owned, because they used to have a solid silver one. They didn't actually acquire it like that though. They melted down a bunch of trinkets and gifts and things that George Nathaniel had picked up during his time out in India, and then they recast the silver as this solid wine cooler. You will not see that one on display, as obviously it was a source of great pride for Kedleston Hall. It was said that it was the heaviest, most expensive piece of silver in the country. So in 2010, thieves broke into the house and stole it. Yeah. I imagine that they will never recover it. It was probably melted back down into little trinkets that are easier to shift. So it's all just come full circle, really. But someone else who doesn't seem to be too happy, although for possibly a different reason, is the ghost of a butler who has been seen in the dining room. We don't have a name for who he is, but it's thought that he might be unhappy with how the dining table is set out if it's not quite right. Or that the silver has been allowed to tarnish, as you can't keep polishing it forever, it will eventually wear away. Not that that would have been an acceptable excuse to the Curzon family butler, but if we leave the house again and go out into the gardens to the south, the ghost of a teenage boy has been seen out here. He appears to be about 16 to 18 years old, and he wears 18th century style clothing. He's not seen very often, and he's not been spotted for a while, but one foggy November evening, a member of staff claimed to see him wandering through the gardens. They were watching him through a window and initially just assumed he was a costumed reenactor who had gotten lost, until he dematerialised. Reenactors don't do that. Richard Felix heard this story and wrote that he believed that this was the ghost of Thomas Chatterton, who does have a very tenuous link to Kedleston. Very long story short, in life, Thomas was very good looking and also a poet who had friends in high places. Despite all of that though, he was completely destitute. He had not a penny to his name. In August 1770, Thomas consumed arsenic and died, aged just 17 years old. The connection to Kedleston is that years after his death, his work was discovered by young ladies from these types of aristocratic families like the Curzons. And because he wasn't a bad looking chap, he sort of became this pin-up figure. It was the thing to have a collection of his poetry, but you could really show how well off you were if you had a portrait of him. Or absolutely forget about it if you had a whole statue of him. So guess what's at Kedleston? Yep, a statue of him lying dead. So because that's literally the only connection with Kedleston, I don't believe that this ghost is Thomas. I think it's much more likely to be a boy who was employed at the house, but I've got no clue specifically who. And while most of these stories have concerned things that have happened to staff members, the volunteers are a huge part of the day-to-day running of the place, and they are ridiculously passionate and knowledgeable, fantastic to talk to. But there's one male volunteer toilet where a presence has been felt. I don't have any more information than that, but if you're a volunteer there, perhaps best not to think about it too much when you're going for a wee. And so those are the ghost stories of Kedleston Hall and the surrounding grounds that we know of. However, there is one more haunted hotspot that you'll pass without giving it a second glance on your way home. It's called a village lodge, and it's currently used for staff housing. And there was one staff member who had been living there peacefully, nothing strange whatsoever, for a good couple of years, until his partner started staying over, and things got weird. It started small for both of them, just seeing very nondescript black shapes in the corner of their eyes in the bedroom. They also had these Harry Potter style floating candles hanging up in one room, and two of them would always turn themselves on with no explanation. But things got real peculiar one Christmas. The staff member received, of all things, a potato peeler. I mean, okay, practical gift, will come in handy when you have potatoes you need to peel, but it was a stupidly sharp thing, and it actually took the skin off his knuckles twice. A bit too efficient at peeling, I suppose. But that's an important detail to mention because you can imagine he probably felt a certain type of way towards this particular potato peeler. He'd only used it for a couple of times before it just disappeared. And Village Lodge, well, yeah, the house itself is comprised of two separate buildings. It's still not a huge amount of space. Not a great number of places that this potato peeler could have got to. He did the first initial look, the cursory glance in main places. Nah, nothing. He did a bit of a deeper look, pulling out drawers, moving stuff around. Still, this peeler was nowhere to be found. He then searched high and low for this damn thing. It had completely dematerialised. After that, he gave up and bought a new potato peeler. We all have a limit, don't we? How long we're willing to look for a thing before we accept that it's lost to the ether. This new potato peeler then sat on the kitchen side for a while. Not urgent, didn't have any potatoes to peel right now. Until, as you do, you get fed up of looking at something on the side, and so he went to put it away. He cut off the cardboard packaging, opened the utensil drawer, and was just about to put it down in there when right there, sitting where the new potato peeler was going to go, was the original one. As if it had been there the entire time and this staff member hadn't turned his kitchen upside down looking for it. There was categorically no way that he would have missed it while he was looking. His partner hadn't found it and put it there. There was no way that he should be looking at it in this drawer right now. But after that, other small objects would disappear, only to reappear weeks later. But there was one time which kind of gave the staff member and his partner pause for thought. Like, what are we really dealing with here? They were deep cleaning the bathroom one day and using wire brushes to clean the tiles. They'd done a good morning's work, and so, in the most British way possible, it was time to stop for a cup of tea, refuel. They dumped the brushes in the sink and headed down for their tea. Only afterwards, when they got back up to the bathroom, one of those wire brushes was bent completely in half, like a hair grip. And they were there wondering, were we scrubbing so hard that it bent the brush and we just didn't notice? But seeing the shape of the brush, that surely would be something that would catch your attention. So then they were left wondering, well, what if it really wasn't us? What if it was something else that did that? And if it was able to exert the force needed to bend a brush, what else was it capable of? But I don't think they need to worry too much. Sensitives who visit, they pick up on the presence of a young girl, and they get the impression that she likes to play tricks and have fun, as in life she'd had very strict parents, so perhaps she wasn't allowed to be herself growing up. Either way, they've taken to calling her Polly the Poltergeist, and while nothing else has happened at Village Lodge, the staff member is more than happy to live in his haunted house. Much happier than he would be if the alarm ever went off in the evil cross-stitch flat at 3 in the morning. And so if these stories are to be believed, which of course, as always, is up to you to make your own minds up, it seems that Kedleston Hall could be classed as a rather haunted spot. We had an absolutely fascinating time walking around the hall and the parkland. All of the staff and volunteers were so knowledgeable and friendly. Most of the information in this video came from them, and we cannot thank them enough. It was such a brilliant day. Do I think that Kedleston Hall is haunted? Absolutely. To have a history of a single family stretching back practically to the Norman conquest, that's a lot of living and a lot of dying. I do think that it's really interesting though that a lot of the ghost stories revolve around household staff rather than the Curzons themselves. But then when you think about it, I suppose it would make sense. For a lot of them, it wasn't their main house, and yeah, it's a lovely residence in the countryside, but overall, it was a pleasure palace. And so it would have been that staff members, they may have spent more time here keeping the estate ticking along, rather than the Curzons who would have come to entertain guests and things like that. That said, I am surprised that Sir Nathaniel, at least, he doesn't have a ghost story. After he poured so much time, attention and family money into the current building alongside Robert Adam. But I do wonder whether the current Curzons, Richard, his partner Emma and their family, whether they've experienced anything a bit weird, actually living in the house itself. And then also, if Village Lodge is said to be haunted, is North Lodge haunted too? So many questions! Because I mean, there's so much more to the Kedleston estate. There's now Kedleston Country House, a restaurant and B&B that was also designed by Robert Adam for Sir Nathaniel in the 1760s, which is said to be haunted by the son of a landlord who died on Boxing Day in 1854. So if you think stately homes are just about the architecture and the history, there could actually be a lot of ghost stories hidden just underneath the surface. But let me know your thoughts. Is it haunted, or are the ghost stories just influenced by the history around the place? I haven't missed the fact that for some of these stories, they're not concrete sightings, they're just people picking up on the energy of something going on, and for a lot of them, we don't have a historical tie back to whatever is haunting an area. Not to say that they're not there though, maybe we just don't know enough about the ghosts yet to be able to say for sure who they are. But if you enjoyed this episode and this mammoth history lesson along with your helping of ghost stories, please do give the video a like. I really do hope that you enjoyed hearing all of the history as much as I did learning about it. I had such a brilliant time getting into all the Curzon family drama. So I'm thinking I would absolutely love to cover more of the UK's stately homes like Kedleston. So expect that coming up. And if you haven't already, but you love hearing about the history behind the mysteries, please do subscribe to the channel. I'd love to have you back for another story soon. But anyway, that is all from me today. Go drink some water and hydrate. Your brain needs it to retain all that juicy information I just told you. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. I feel like I've been talking for 6 hours straight. I don't remember what life was like before talking about Kedleston. I'm not mad about it though. I had a great time doing that one. That was incredible. Throw more stately homes at me. I'm gonna go through the requests list as well and see which ones look good. I want to know everyone's historical family drama though. I'm just nosy.